Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Unofficial WCC Hoops podcast. I'm Zach Farmer. We are only a couple months away from the start of the college basketball season, and it is starting to get exciting. We're going to start to do team previews in the coming weeks, so that will be exciting as well. We're bringing on Tristan Freeman from FanSided, Busting Brackets, and he'll be on to talk about the new transfer rule, and also we'll talk a little bit about WCC hoops and where we see some of these teams going this season. But before we get to all of that, we're going to talk a little bit about the teams that maybe have something to prove this year, because this going into this season, there's going to be a lot of talk about teams that maybe underperformed or teams that have the talent and maybe need to make that next jump, make that next leap. And if we talked about this last year, I would have clearly said that team was St. Mary's. This was a team who had come off a year where they had a very down year from their normal expectations. Obviously, some of that was due to COVID, some of it was due to injury, but for whichever reason, this was a team that missed the NCAA tournament. They did make it to the NIT, but again, an overall season where it was a season that you were left feeling flat about the Gales. And obviously, what we saw last season was that they came out and proved everybody wrong, that was the outlier, that was not what this team and this program was going to be, that they picked up actually right where they left off really in 2020 as opposed to the 2021 season. We started to see them have that defensive identity. They found their offensive identity. You saw great improvements from a number of the guys up and down that roster, the Tommy Kuzis, the Matthias Toss, the Dan Fotus, like up and down. We saw that last season. So who is that this year? And to me, I think the obvious one has to be BYU. This was a team last year that many people had back in the NCAA tournament before the season started. The schedule was tough. They had the roster, and everyone thought that they were going to make that run. And yes, injuries played a big part in what prevented BYU from making that leap. Got injuries to Richard Harward, injuries to Gavin Baxter really hampered the season in the front court that BYU had, which is why we got to see Fus Traore a lot more than we probably would have otherwise. Now, obviously, he's very clearly turning into what could be a star this season in the WCC, but we'll still have to kind of have that wait and see with him as he kind of develops and everything else. But also last year, we looked at this team and it was, where was the offense going to come from? We knew about Alex Barcelo. We knew Tejon Lucas was also going to bring in some offense to that squad. Both those guys are gone. And really the highlight of that is obviously Barcelo. This is a guy who could drop 20 on any given night. This is a guy who was very clearly one of the best scorers on the West Coast in the WCC. But he didn't have a running mate. And that is what really hurt BYU as the season went on. Because as we saw, WCC teams started to target Barcelo and make it a point to force someone else on that roster to be that scorer, to be that other guy. St. Mary's made life difficult on Barcelo. Gonzaga made life difficult on Barcelo. USF made life difficult on Barcelo. Not to say that he did not have good games, because he still did have a few good games amongst those, but the shots were more difficult. He was pressured more often. That's kind of what I'm getting at. Can BYU rebound from a season where they finished fifth in the WCC, and now also add the backdrop of going into the Big 12? This is your last chance to prove, I mean, obviously, like their Big 12 membership is not going to be revoked if they finish 7th in the WCC. But with all the excitement about joining the Big 12, all the excitement about moving to the big conference, it seems like the men's basketball program has to have a rebound year, a year where they kind of prove that they belong in the Big 12. Because right now, there are a lot of teams who are going to be competing between those 2 and 6 spots. Now, if you ask me, like, I think that 2 spot is kind of solidified at this stage. Like, that's going to be St. Mary's. And where does BYU fit in with the USFs, the San Diegos, the Portlands? Because keep in mind that, again, this is a BYU team that finished behind USF, behind Santa Clara, and was just 1 game away from actually finishing behind Portland, as Portland had an amazing season last year. So BYU is the one that has the most to prove. Did they find enough offense to really play in the WCC, especially when you have a couple of really 3 teams who were incredible defensively a year ago? You have a San Diego team that is on the rise with a number of really good transfers. You have a Portland team who now has the confidence of a year ago, coming back with most of the pieces intact and now adding a couple of transfers as well. Did BYU do enough to combat all of these changes in the conference? And my answer looking at it at the moment would be no, they didn't do enough. It feels like BYU had a very disappointing offseason. You already lose. You had lost Lucas. You had lost Barcelo. You also lost Caleb Lohner, who transferred to Baylor. So they'll see Caleb Lohner next season when they join the Big 12. Is the addition of Rudy Williams enough? Did they do enough to bolster the front court? Did they do enough to bolster their backcourt? I don't know if they did enough of those things. Do they play good enough defense? That's kind of always been a question about BYU. And maybe there was like a year and a half or so where like it looked like BYU was a much better defensive team, but then that all came crashing and falling apart a year ago. So in my mind, it's BYU. It's like they have the toughest hill to climb when it comes to regaining some of the legitimacy and that I guess legitimacy is the best word, like within the conference, because right now it's like it looks like they have slipped out of the conversation of this top tier and now have slipped into the conversation of being mid-tier. And then the other one to me is LMU. And I know like it's easy to point at one of the bottom teams from a year ago. But I think it has to be LMU. And the reason I say that is because of what we saw 2 seasons ago. We saw LMU with potential. We saw LMU seemingly moving in the right direction. We saw them look like a team that was going to compete in a significant way in this conference, at least for like that the second, third, fourth spots. When we say compete in this conference, like basically, unless it's specifically noted, we're not talking about competing with Gonzaga. And I think even more so, this is a point of that Stan Johnson has something to prove. Can he build this program back up? Because LMU has had maybe one of the hardest times in this conference really regaining any sort of consistency. And if you want to know like how inconsistent this program has been, not just through Stan Johnson's tenure, but over the last 30 years, that since the Bo Kimball and Hank Gathers era, this LMU team has not had consecutive winning seasons at all. And That is almost one of the most astounding stats I think I found about LMU or anyone really in the conference. The fact that they have not had consecutive winning seasons in the last 30 years. They'll have one good year and then they'll drop back down. Maybe they'll get back up, but then they drop back down. This is LMU's pattern. And they did have the down year last year after an up year the year before. I think if you look at this roster, there's not a ton of talent on this team right now, but that doesn't mean that there can't be improvements. That doesn't mean that like there should be an expectation of that rebound or something to prove means that this team needs to be in fourth place or third place or fifth. For this team, something to prove means looking like they're on the same page, looking like there's momentum moving in the right direction. And I think that's what something to prove for LMU looks like this season and going into and moving forward after that. But as we kind of like alluded, there are tiers in this league. And I think that's one of the things that most conferences I feel probably have this some sort of like tier system or whatnot of. They're the clear programs who are always at the top, always consistent, and they'll always be there. And then consistently down the line. So what do those look like for the WCC? I like for the most part, I think this is pretty simple. Now, I think it's changed a little bit over, say, the last few years. But let's take a look at it this way. I'll give you kind of like the numbers of average finish over the last, say, 8 years. And then we can kind of see like where these teams usually finish, where these teams usually end up. Because we know that Gonzaga has finished in first each of the last 8 years. I think it might be 9 or 10, but we're only going back 8 years, so we're saying 8. The average team to finish in second is St. Mary's at 2.5 is the average finish for St. Mary's, followed by BYU at 2.9, then it's followed by USF, then Santa Clara, then San Diego, LMU, then Santa Clara, then Pacific, Pepperdine, San Diego, LMU, and then following up with Portland. Obviously, we know Portland being at the back end of this, even despite their good year last year, had a really big uphill climb because they finished in last 4 of those seasons in the last 8. So there was always they were going to be the last one. But again, like think about that middle group. So you had Gonzaga up top, St. Mary's was 2, BYU 3. I think that over the last 8 years, you could say like that's the top tier. It's Gonzaga, St. Mary's, BYU. That's pretty well established. But then that middle tier, the consistent mid tier of this league has been USF, Santa Clara, and then I think is where you start to see a little bit of the separation with the Pepperdine, Pacific, San Diego, LMU, Portland. Because their average finish is 6th or lower, which means that like more times than not, they have spent more time in that opening round of the WCC tournament than any other teams. And that's half the league. But let's fast forward it to what it looks like today. Rather than taking this long look at it, let's take a look a little bit closer. Because right now, what are those tiers? Because I think right now you can clearly say it's Gonzaga. I mean, if you want to put Gonzaga on its own tier, they would be on their own tier. Let's make that very clear. But then it's St. Mary's. And I think that's very clear. 1, 2, Gonzaga, St. Mary's. That's tier 1.